Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 28. I'm your host, Milton Ali Mahdi. Today, we are going to look at DEDAN Kimathi. DEDAN Kimathi was the leader of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, Kenyan African nationalist who fought for independence of Kenya from British colonial rule and fought to recover their land, which had been seized by Europeans from Britain after Kenya became a British protectorate/colony. I know I've mentioned DEDAN Kimathi in passing in past podcasts when I was dealing with Oginga Odinga, who was one of the nationalist leaders for independence in Kenya. And he was interesting in the sense that he was a socialist, unlike his colleagues and contemporaries in the Kenyan government. Of course, Jomo Kenyatta became the first prime minister, and then later on, president when Kenya became a republic, and Odinga became his vice president. But the two parted ways. Odinga was an avowed socialist, and he did not believe that Kenya would be able to create a different dispensation by just inheriting the colonial regime, as has been the case in most African countries, where the European suits and ties were simply replaced by Africans who took over the positions formerly occupied by the Europeans in terms of the politics and some of the economics. The Europeans maintained economic dominance for a long time, and even today in Kenya have a considerable influence, just as the case is in South Africa, long after the end of formal apartheid in 1990, and specifically in 1994 when Mandela became president. The Europeans in South Africa still dominate the economy and also the land ownership, which in Kenya was also, and is actually, still one of the outstanding unresolved issues stemming from the era of colonial rule. DEDAN Kimathi is a very interesting history. He was not as highly educated as the Kenyattas, for example, but he was tremendously intelligent, and his organizational skills were exceptional, and that's what I want to focus on discussing. And I will read from parts of this book, and that is partly the reason why I wanted to focus on him again today. The book is DEDAN Kimathi Speaks, and the author is Maina Wakinyati, a Kenyan historian who's always insisted on telling the Kenyan story from the voice of the Kenyans. Outstanding supporter of telling the true story of the resistance struggle in Kenya. Of course, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army were demonized as the Mau Mau, M-A-U, by the British. Nobody even knows the origin of that word, but it sounded damning enough, and it conjured up these images of African quote-unquote savages wielding pangas, that's the Kiswahili word for machetes, and cutting down Europeans in Kenya. When in fact, at the end of the day, by the end of that liberation struggle, they started dying down in 1957 with the capture and execution of DEDAN Kimathi, and really ended by 1960. And the death toll of the Africans in Kenya range anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000, when the Europeans, less than 100, perished in this conflict. And of course, many of the Kenyans died because they were held in concentration camps. About 1,000 were executed by the British by hanging. And then many more died because the British bombed the areas of the suspected operating areas where the Kenya Land and Freedom Army operated from. And of course, in many cases, made no distinction between actual fighters and civilians in Kenya. But I want to focus on the organizational aspects of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. Kimathi was born in 1920, and he had a gift for writing and oratorical skills. He was a very powerful speaker, very persuasive. In primary school, he had already demonstrated his gifts for writing and speaking. He did not go much beyond secondary school, and he joined the army. The Kenyan colonial army, of course, was called the King's African Army. King's African Rifles, rather, that was the formal name. But he did not stay long because obviously the officers were Europeans, and he felt that the Africans recruited in the army were not treated professionally, certainly not as well as the Europeans who were in the army. So he took on several jobs, odd jobs, to make a living, including even carpentry, and then ended up being a teacher, even with his not advanced level of education. When you compare with people like Jomo Kenyatta, of course, who had a graduate degree from the London School of Economics. So then at some point he joined the Kenyan African Union, which was the political party, one of the political parties formed to agitate for better conditions for Africans in Kenya. And the party also included Kenyans who had fought on behalf of empire. During World War II, World War I, the colonial powers in Africa, Britain, France, Germany, they had all recruited Africans to fight in their colonial wars, basically conscripted them. So when they fought in World War II and came back and saw that the Europeans who had fought from Kenya and fought overseas together with the Africans were rewarded financially and with large tracts of land. And they became very resentful. They were already resentful because their land had been stolen. Kenya was one of the countries in Africa with a relatively large European population that came during the colonial regime. And 4 million acres of some of the most prime lands had been taken away and given to 1,000 European families. The Kikuyu people primarily were displaced from what was converted into so-called white highlands. So they did not even hide or conceal the contempt of the colonial regime. So now you have a combination of a people whose land had been stolen with a campaign of ethnic cleansing from the 1890s to the early parts of the 1920s or so, when the resistance had died out and the land had been usurped by that time. So you have that early dispossession. And then now you have the insult of the post-World War II era, where after toward the end of the war, there was the Atlantic Charter announced by the United States and Britain, so Roosevelt and Churchill. Of course, it was much more pushed by the Americans, not the Imperial Britain. So Britain was basically playing lip service. And the promise of the Atlantic Charter was that the peoples in the colonized parts of the world would have the right to self-determination. The British did not mean to keep that promise in the British colonies. And the Kenyans who had fought and came back with a different level of consciousness were not willing to allow that domination to continue. So people like Kenyatta and his colleagues formed the Kenya African Union. Kimathi joined that for a while as a young man. So it was formed in 44. By that time, he was 24 years old. So he joined as a young man. But he did not stay long in the Kenyan African Union. Kenyan African Union believed in pursuing a constitutional approach for improving the rights of Africans in Kenya. And younger people like Kimathi were not willing because they saw that as completely unrealistic. And they started discussing a much more radical approach, which of course was the armed struggle. And eventually, some of the original members of the Kenyan African Union also joined this armed resistance, which became the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. They were concentrated mostly in the forest. That's where they set up their headquarters. They had ultimately about 8 separate fighting armies, units, spread in different parts of the forest. And they also had fighters in major cities like Nairobi, which is the capital city of Kenya. They had tremendous organizational skills. They had the fighting component as well as the political side. So the armed wing in the beginning was led by General Mathege, but he was quickly succeeded or overtaken by DEDAN Kimathi, who was much more daring, much more aggressive, and had better organizational skills. And they set up what they called a war council. And then on the political side, they had a parliament with representatives coming from the different regions of Kenya. So when you hear about all this, which I knew of to some extent, but not as better informed as I have now become after reading this book, DEDAN Kimathi Speaks, which I highly recommend. Each of the fighting units had a secretary whose job it was to document the history of this armed struggle for independence. So developed a very rich archives, which were well concealed and buried in parts of the forest, although the British ultimately were able to seize much of these archives, and which they destroyed. But there were still substantial amounts of documents. And that is why this particular book is very rich in that sense, because it contains a lot of the communications. It contains letters from Kimathi to his fighters, to his commanders in the different parts of the forest, letters to politicians, people in the parliament that they set up. And this was different from the colonial parliament. The British had also set up what they called the Legislative Council. And these were the emerging African bourgeoisie and Asians as well as the Europeans, of course. And the Kenya Land of Freedom Army fighters regarded that, of course, as a mere rubber stamp legislature, and viewed it with utter contempt, and considered the revolutionary parliament that they set up as the authentic representatives of the people of Kenya. And also the communications includes letters that Kimathi wrote to the British colonial authorities, and on some occasions to the governor, to the commanders of the British colonial army, and to the British Prime Minister in the United Kingdom. He also wrote to different leaders, like the Egyptian leadership. He wrote to Kwame Nkrumah in the early 1950s, because the war itself formally launched in 1952, as I said earlier. And by that time, Nkrumah was the chief minister in Ghana, because Ghana was not yet fully independent. Ghana did not win its independence until 1957. So as chief minister, Nkrumah had control of domestic politics in what was then the Gold Coast, because obviously it took on the name Ghana only in 1957 at the time of independence. So Nkrumah did not have control of the defense of Ghana or foreign policy. So he could not have done much to help Kimathi. He also wrote to leaders of the African diaspora, like George Padmore in London. He wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois. He wrote to Gregory Malenkov, who was briefly leader of what was then the Soviet Union. So he knew the importance of communications and propaganda, and he was fully aware of global and domestic conditions. And it is important to know of this, because this, of course, completely repudiates the nonsensical racist propaganda of the British media, and ultimately the United States media as well, because British media, unfortunately, have always served to distort, mislead, and misguide United States media, as Malcolm X used to like saying. Not that American media are not capable of misguiding themselves independently when it comes to issues such as in Africa, of course. And obviously the British were trying to sell the narrative that these are African, quote-unquote, savages who were bewildered by European civilization and were basically fighting to not only drive the white man out of Kenya, as if that would have been a crime when our people are fighting to recover their land, but additionally, that they were fighting to take back Kenya to the barbaric old ways of their African ancestors. And if you research and look back at the American coverage in the 1950s, you'll find that they just reflected and mirrored the same British propaganda. Yeah, major publications like Time Magazine, the New York Times, all had this similar coverage, referring to the Mau Mau, not the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, but the Mau Mau, as a combination of Africans who were inspired by sorcery and Soviet communism. Quite outlandish. But if you read the documents that the leadership of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army were producing and disseminating, and as I said, I'll read a little bit from it in a few minutes so that you can get a sense of it. You'll see how preposterous the British propaganda really was. Now, one might say that perhaps one of the primary weaknesses that the Kenya Land and Freedom Army faced was when it comes to the issue of ideology, and that's something that Amilcar Cabral mentioned at a much later stage, of course, because when DEDAN Kimati fought, in the 1950s, there was much earlier. Cabral didn't start building up his movement until the 1960s, and to engage against the Portuguese colonials in Guinea-Bissau. But of course, Cabral, as many of you must know, emerged as one of the leading African theoreticians when it came to the political aspect of the liberation struggle. Fidel Castro met him also in the 1960s and said of Cabral and Guinea-Bissau that this is the country in Africa that has the most outstanding chance of succeeding in its colonial struggle and in the ideological preparation to run the post-colonial state in Africa. And as many of you know, Cabral, of course, was unfortunately assassinated in 1972, shortly before his fighters of the PAIGC liberation movement declared independence of Guinea-Bissau. So this is what Cabral once said, quote, "The ideological deficiency, not to say the total lack of ideology within the liberation movements, which is basically due to ignorance of the historical reality which these movements claim to transform, constitutes one of the greatest weaknesses of our struggle against imperialism, if not the greatest weakness of all." And of course, he was talking specifically of Guinea-Bissau, but generally also in terms of most of the liberation struggles in African countries. But at the same time, we cannot really blame the fighters in Kenya. They fought out of, they were inspired primarily by nationalism to correct a wrong. They knew that colonial rule was wrong. They knew it was wrong for Europeans to come and kick, their parents and grandparents off the land and seize the land and monopolize the economy, the production, and the wealth, and introduce and enforce a system of racist discrimination where they were referred to not even as second-class citizens, but fifth-class citizens in their own country. There's a documentary called Mau Mau secret war, which I think I've referred to in the past, and was produced by British television, where a European in Kenya actually said that they regarded the Africans as fifth-class citizens, and they thought there was nothing wrong with that it was just quite normal, it was the way of things. So obviously, these are the outrages that inspired the fighters of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. They wanted the land back, and they wanted to govern their own country and not to be governed by Europeans. Now, of course, they were also inspired by countries that had chosen to reject the capitalist model. And that is why the DEDAN Kimati reached out to the leadership in Egypt, reached out to the Soviet Union. Now, but perhaps it was not a developed ideological component of the struggle as Cabral would have preferred. And that is important. I agree. That is important because fighting to get rid of the oppressor is only one half of the struggle. What follows the next day is a challenge. And that is actually a subject that we can devote a whole podcast on, and perhaps actually I will devote a whole episode just to discuss that. What happens the day after? The day after has not been productive in most of the African countries. But one wonders that even if the ideological preparation had been better, would it have made a significant difference without individual African countries being able to protect their independence? I highly doubt that. I think at the end of the day, it would boil down to what Kwame Nkrumah argued persuasively, that without African unity, a United States of Africa, Africa would not be able to withstand the desire by the Western industrialized world to continue getting Africa's resources, either for little or for nothing, which is the case today. So even with the ideological preparation, perhaps one could say the ideological preparation might have placed the African leaders in a better position to understand the importance of coming together and forming a United States of Africa. So that is one argument I can give to that. Because certainly Kwame Nkrumah was intellectually and ideologically prepared. And had he had, maybe even a dozen or so colleagues who shared that mindset in the 1960s, we would be talking about very different conditions in Africa today. So I want to read parts from the book, different parts of the book. I'll read very briefly. I want to read one part here where the Kenya Land and Freedom Army are writing to the British colonial authorities. And this is only from part of that document. And they're saying here, quote, "Do you not remember what your grandfathers did during the reign of King Richard II, when 60,000 slaves went to the king and demanded their freedom? These people tore down prison walls and the houses of the rich men they hated and killed many who were their enemies. They burned the houses of the lawyers, tax collectors, and king's officers who had wronged them and killed many men of that sort, cut off their heads, put them on poles, and set them up on London Bridge. Because of their resistance, the king made them free forever. And this is, of course, is a reference to the what is known as the Wat Taylor Rebellion of 1381 in England. They weren't quite set free. I mean, Richard II promised all these concessions, but then after the leader of the rebellion was killed, he renounced all these concessions. But the important point is here is that obviously the people in leadership of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army were informed and knew history, and they were raising this as an example to justify their own struggle. Now, when you read these kind of documents, then of course you know convincingly that these were not at all the people that the British were claiming that they were, a bunch of ignorant African, quote unquote, savages. And Kimathi knew the importance of trying to get this information out. And he wrote many letters to editors and articles for newspapers in Kenya. Of course, the newspapers also are very constricted and limited in what they could publish. And in some cases, the colonial attorney general actually made it a crime to publish certain documents that were released by the guerrillas. Let me read another from another document. This is was a declaration that was disseminated in Nairobi, Kenya, the capital city, after the British declared a state of emergency and started bringing all these armed forces, European soldiers, to fight the resistance. And the document is called, "We Will Fight to the Last Man." Quote, "Fellow compatriots, since 1920, we have tried to regain our freedom peacefully, but all of our efforts have come to naught. The British are not interested in constitutional negotiations. Now they've arrested and imprisoned our leaders, proscribed our political party, and declared war on us." So let me just pause here for a second. Here he's referring to people like Kenyatta and the leadership of the Kenya African Union. They had been arrested and accused of leading the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, which was completely false because they believed the constitutional approach. But they were nevertheless tried in kangaroo court